Hello everybody, this is Antonio Wolf, and just wanted to make a response video to Chad Haig's latest video on his comments on the introductions to Hegel's Science of Logic. I just wanted to talk about some points he makes. I'll link his video on the description. I think it was good overall, but I do have some comments of things which I think are misunderstandings by Chad. One of the things Chad mentions is that obviously Hegel is very hard to read, very obscure, and one of the things that isn't so clear to people is that Hegel's philosophy is one of immanent critique. Chad says that it's actually quite clear in the Science of Logic. Just want to make a quick point that I think it's actually even clearer in the Phenomenology of Spirit, particularly in the introduction, not the preface, the introduction to the Phenomenology of Spirit. Although, I suppose I see why people would probably miss it, because that chapter is super Hegelian. If you don't know the logic, most of it will actually not make much sense. It'd be simply because you have to know how to read that chapter. But nonetheless, the stuff that Hegel says about immanent critique there, he doesn't call it immanent critique, and he doesn't, I don't remember him saying that specifically in the Science of Logic either. So much as in the Phenomenology's introduction, Hegel notes that, well, you know, how are we to judge this whole issue of truth and knowing? Well, you know, we can try to be like the skeptics who just you know, negate everything, and you know, we'll just go ahead and show you that every claim is equal to every other claim. You know, all of them are unfounded, all of them can't be proven against each other. And so, you know, ancient skepticism just simply said, well, there's nothing to be said about it, you know, we'll remain agnostic. Key thing for you to know, by the way, ancient skepticism, the original skepticism, is not a it's not a denial of knowledge. The original skepticism is the agnosticism of knowledge, because no form of knowing could prove itself to be the form of knowing against any other. You know, you can. This comes up in Kant as well. You know, Kant's antinomies of reason are precisely this kind of problem, where you can have two equally valid arguments for completely opposite things. You can argue that the world had to have a beginning, and you can argue that the world didn't have to have a beginning. You can argue that the world is finite, you can argue that the world is infinite, and both of those are rationally valid, and you can't, there is no rational basis on which you can choose one or the other, so you have to remain agnostic. And so there's a little bit of a thing about Kantian dialectics as opposed to Hegelian dialectics, by the way. So yeah, so immanent critique in the Phenomenology of Spirit, Hegel says, well, basically, all right, we're going to let go of any external criteria. We're not going to deal with he's mainly talking with skepticism along Sextus Empiricus' line, in which there's going to be no posited issue of the criterion on knowing. You know, instead we're just going to let each form of knowing posit for itself its own criterion, and we're just going to play with the rules that we're given and just find out, are they consistent or are they not? Can they actually hold as absolute or can they not, in the intelligible sense? And so that ends up obviously being an immanent critique, in which you're not using an external criterion whatsoever. You're just going to go by what you're given, and either it works or it doesn't. Of course, the skeptics stop at the point at where they realize that it doesn't, and Hegel says, well, no, we're going to keep going. We're going to find out something positive from this failure. Of course, it's very difficult for you to figure out how one comes up with this failure as a positive, but there's various at-face ways of saying this that aren't too bad, but the way Hegel actually does it is rather interesting. Another thing that Chad brings up is he says quite a bit that the logic, you know, is Hegel's attempt at an absolute beginning. This is not true. The logic is not an absolute beginning. As a matter of fact, the logic isn't even a beginning. Actually, let me rephrase it. The logic is not the beginning. Once you have the Hegelian system finished, you realize you can begin anywhere. It doesn't matter. The key to it all is the logic. The reason to begin with, the key to it all is the logic in that you know how to think things as content forms. It's not the logic, as in the science of logic, where you have explicitly how each content form works as a content form, pure content form. The logic for itself is a beginning, and it's the preferable beginning for a very obvious reason, and Hegel tells us that reason in the prefaces and the introductions, which is it assumes the least. If you start with logic as an absolute science, because we're always trying to do that in absolute science, logic is the easiest, because logic is just the thinking of thinking. You don't have an external subject matter. The subject matter is the activity of thinking itself. And so the buildup is not going to presuppose any prior concepts. That's what makes this the favorable beginning, that you don't have to have prior concepts. Everything else, you will have prior concepts, whether you realize it or not. You cannot begin with the philosophy of nature and be assured that you know that where you begin is actually where you should be, where you can or should begin, simply because you do not know what valid concepts look like. If you haven't come to the realization of how logic itself really works, you're not going to be sure whether, if you start with, say, something like quantum mechanics, your notions of particles and waves are actually sensical. That is, that they have meaning, valid meaning. You're not going to know that these are valid concepts. If you start with societies, you don't know that your presuppositions about human beings and psychology and everything else are valid concepts. And so when you start with anything else, you're going to be stuck in a problem in which you cannot immediately go forward, because there's going to be a problem with everything that you're assuming prior to that. So you're going to have to do a transcendental deduction backwards to investigate every single concept that you're presupposing and go through each one and come to the realization that there's something wrong with them. Because if you haven't built it up, what you're using is simply implicit in the background of your mind, and you're not actually clear on whether that is valid or not. So you have to do these transcendental investigations backwards into the grounds to find whether these things are valid or not. And you're going to find very quickly that a lot of it is very hard to deduce backwards, because it's not clear how it's valid or why it should be. So the logic is simply the best beginning to make, because it presupposes the least. Since we don't have to presuppose anything below it, we're just going to have to build up from it. And this is the much easier route. It is the least amount of work compared to like starting at the most concrete and going towards the most abstract. Just saves you a lot of time. So the logic is not an absolute beginning. He does some comparisons. Chad makes some comparisons to traditional logic, it's pretty. I thought it was pretty all right. One of the things that I think he's not aware of is that Kantian transcendental logic is probably the closest thing to Hegelian logic, where Kant's transcendental logic was a logic of objects themselves, that how you think the objects is the reality of objects out there, so that when you make these syllogisms, you cannot fail but think a valid object, even if that object is merely an imaginary object, a fictitious object, that hasn't been invented yet. Nonetheless, you know that the way you think about it is valid, and therefore that object is a real possibility in our world. This isn't the same, so if you have a transcendental, so Hegel's logic is The categories are in a way transcendental logic, because stuff like being, nothing, becoming, existence, essence, concept, actuality, possibility, all these things, these are the real categories for the construction of objects and the relation of objects. And insofar as you connect these categories, immanently in their logics, that they don't contradict in the way that they connect to each other, you will always think something valid. So it's pretty neat. So you have objective logics of things, rather than just formal logics of symbols, like propositional logic and P's and Q's. Another thing that Chad says, he says Hegel challenges static eternal validity, which can be achieved positively. And he brings up something by Zizek, saying that Hegel's Aufhebung is sublation. Does not produce this stable positivity. Yes and no. I think that one has to come to the acceptance that Hegel's logic does produce eternally valid categories. The logic of being and nothing is the eternal content of the logic of becoming. And becoming doesn't become untrue just because you move on. Everything else builds off of becoming. Everything else builds off of being and nothing. So these things are not absolutes, and they are not dead positivities, but they are eternal, and they're eternally valid, and they don't change. Becoming doesn't become something else later on. Becoming will forever remain becoming, insofar as you're dealing with things at that level of becoming. When you move on from that, you're talking about something else, what you do. And so, the logic of becoming is that the universe didn't stay at becoming. It didn't stay just going bouncing from being and nothing back again. It moved on to existence and all these other things. But nonetheless, becoming remains true, it remains valid, and remains eternal. And this is, he also says, the notion has no fixed existence. Again, yes and no. Yes, in that no single category is the category. No, in that every category remains fixed as itself, insofar as you remain in its immanence. If you remain the immanence of but nothing and being, you're forever in the category of becoming. And that category doesn't change. Becoming doesn't become something else unless you transcend it. And you transcend it through its own immanence, through what it does, in that it does more than what we cognize explicitly when we're just thinking of becoming. And that is because the universal, what Chadafrican calls the notion, which is an old term. He's reading it from the Miller translation, but I quite like the translation of concept far better. In which you have to realize that the notion is this movement. Think of the infinity symbol. The notion is this entire movement. The elements are each of the divided little ovals or circles, whatever you want to call them, in the infinity symbol. Those are the being and the nothing. But this eternal movement, as an eternal movement, is fixed. The change does not stop changing. Precisely in that, it's the paradox that, the only unchanging things is change. So, in that sense, Chad is wrong by being one-sided in that approach. When he's talking about, he talks a bit about the understanding, and its relation to reason, and he mentions a quote by Hegel. He says that that reason resolves the determinations of the understanding into nothing, in generating the universal. When What that means is that that reason, the movement of infinity, makes the determinations of the understanding, which are those two moments in infinity, into nothing, in that it negates them. Nothing is the movement of negation. It is the power of negation. It is negation as such, or negativity itself. And in simply this movement itself, you see it. This is absolute negativity. It's just pure negation, 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 which keeps negating itself. And when it connects back to itself, it's fully negated itself, and in negating itself, that is its own positivity. When you have these two moments and you let them carry out their negation, they're going to produce this infinite movement. And that's the universal, and that is the resolution of the understanding's determinations into nothing. They're negated. They're negated as absolutes, and therefore they're not. They themselves are not infinite positivities. They're not just mere infinite substance. They're part of this movement, this infinite negation. So the whole movement is the movement of nothing to nothing, negation to negation, which, when it closes in on itself, appears as a positivity. In that it is eternal change, which itself is changeless. There's a bit of a thing which I didn't quite understand. He mentions that notional thinking is somewhat of a paradox of understanding with concrete universality. He mentions how Plato used to think that the forms were somewhere out there, and I don't agree with that. I think if you read around Hegel's, not Hegel, but Plato's scholarship, this is a contentious comprehension of Plato. The idea that Plato thought that ideas were out there somewhere in some other realm or somewhere else in the world. That's a misreading that can easily be gotten from certain portions of Plato's dialogues and works. But there are other places where it's far more nuanced than that. So, Plato was aware of these difficulties, and if he was aware of these difficulties, it's hard to believe that, say, something like in the Parmenides, he would critique the very view that people say he has, and then somehow, Plato, we're supposed to believe that Plato still believed this, even though he was very aware of the hard issues. And then Hegel is compared to Aristotle, where, the form is immanent to the things themselves. And there's really not much of a concrete paradox. I mean, it's the same thing I was saying, the infinity. Think of the movement of infinity, and where each side of the infinite, those little two enclosed circles, or whatever you want to call them, areas, those are the concretes. That's the concrete thing. Those are individuals. You have one, you have two, and you have this movement in between, which makes both of them. And it appears only as both of them. You don't actually see this movement for itself present in any single moment. You see it only in the totality of all these moments. So it's not much of a paradox. I mean, it's the same thing of how this movement. Chad also says that reason goes beyond the understanding by being an understanding that no longer posits a beyond. That was somewhat unclear to me. How he said that, I kind of get what he means. That the understanding reaches this dialectical paradox in which being is nothing, or the world is both rationally infinite and rationally finite. And the understanding wants to resolve this by finding some other option, by finding some third option that is not either of these options, that will explain these options. But the understanding is not wrong in that. What the understanding is wrong in is not in positing that there's something more beyond it to be comprehended, to be understood. I mean, really, literally, think about it, the word understood. You're under and you're looking up to see what that thing is. If you were to understand the dialectic, you would stand on the ground, which is down here. You stand on the ground on which these are grounded. and then you would get why they relate the way they do and why this contradiction would probably make sense. The understanding is not wrong in thinking that way. What is wrong, what it is wrong in thinking, is that if it cannot find this ground, then the dialectic, these two parts of infinity, don't make any sense, and that we can't accept this because it's absolute paradox, that, you know, being just can't be nothing and nothing just can't be being. That's the mistake of the understanding. That's where it goes wrong, that it sees this, it sees that this is what reason produces. You know, when you just think purely, when you think rationally, and you produce paradox, the understanding does not accept that this is the nature of reason, and that these are not paradoxes which are not which are unintelligible. Rather, the way we will understand them is by looking at why it is that reason produces them. And of course, Kant thinks that these are produced by going beyond what we can actually think. You know, these are produced by going into dialectical illusions of the transcendental. You know, we go beyond the phenomenal, and we can only know the phenomenal. And once we go beyond that, of course, we get these paradoxes, because these things of reason, these pure concepts of reason, do not accord with anything empirical. We don't have a ground to choose which one is which anymore. And then Kant ends up resolving this by splitting the dialectic and putting one on the side of the phenomena and one on the side of noumena. So, you know, we have determinism on the side of phenomena, and then we have freedom on the side of noumena. We have or rather, to rephrase it, we have necessity on the side of phenomena and freedom on the side of noumena. You know, we have an endless regress on the side of phenomena, and we have an absolute final ground in noumena. Except, you know, on the side of the noumenal, we can't know what that is. But on the side of the phenomenal, we can comprehend that. But reason tells us on the side of the noumenal, there must be that, even if we can never access it completely. And what reason does, once Hegelian comprehension comes about, what reason does is merely it says, okay, we see this whole process of the back and forth of the dialectic, and that's it. And you don't fight it, and you say, so this is what reason produces. Then this is what we're actually thinking. You know, if the full movement of thought is this circle, then this is actually a complete concept. You know, and this is thinking of concepts as unities. So if the circle is completed in the motion, it connects back to itself, then we know we have a full concept. And so the question is then, what this whole seeming contradiction actually correspond to? You know, this contradiction of being is nothing, the movement of being and nothing, being and nothing. There's a concept that we have, and we call it becoming. And what is becoming? Usually, it's precisely this movement of being and nothing. And so all of a sudden, this thing that didn't seem to make sense seems to now be sensible, sensical. I mean, it seems to be meaningful. It seems comprehensible. And all we had to do was simply give up this desire to keep things apart and realize that they are just this total movement. And so, you know, reason just stands back, looks at the dialectic and says, yes, that's it. You know, this dialectic is a concept itself. And then before his stream, unfortunately, cut out last time, he mentions that obviously Hegelian negation is different from regular negation. You know, regular negation is what we would call, Hegel calls abstract negation, which is, you know, you say something's either true or false. You know, false is abstract negation, it has nothing true. But determinate negation, which is Hegelian negation, or negation of negation, all these other things, or contentful negations, in which the not true does not mean completely false. And there is something peculiar about this, by the way, in that nothing is abstract negativity for itself, you know, abstracted apart from everything else. When we make abstract negations, that's literally what we do. We completely negate all positive determinacy in whatever it is that we're dealing with, propositions, objects, whatever you want, and we reduce that content to nothing, and nothing is the content of falsehood. And it's the content of falsehood merely in that it cannot say anything at all. You know, it's immediate. There is nothing intelligible in it if we just stop at nothing. But nothing itself is not untruth. It is not falsehood, really. It's not the separate thing from truth itself. Rather, it is just a very, very poor form of truth. So, you can translate our regular notions of logic into these kinds of things, and it's very interesting. Anyways, I'll leave it at that. See you around.